My name is Brian Johnston, and I'm here today interviewing Dr. J. Douglas Eaton as part of our Pioneers in Student Services program in Canada. Dr. Eaton, would you like to start out by telling us some of your background here at Memorial and how you became involved in student services in what we call now the early days?
You always start an interview with the word well, so I better start it correctly and say, well. I came to Memorial in 1953, and my letter of appointment said that I was instructor in physical training. My salary was $3,200 a year, and the gymnasium I had was that little gymnasium in the buildings on Parade Street. So I came really as the physical education teacher for the university. Students who went to the university and the old campus still call me coach, because I coached every team that we had in those days, which weren't very many, actually. So I was in that position for 10 years, from 1953 to 1963, or 1964, I guess. And in 1964, the university was interested in appointing a dean of men and a dean of women to help students with their personal problems, primarily with their personal problems, and also with some academic problems they might have. So I was appointed Dean of Men, and Sarah Drinkwater, who was Sarah McGlashan, she was appointed Dean of Women. A year after we were appointed, in 1964, I was appointed director, or dean of student, I can't remember now. I was either director of student affairs or dean of student affairs. And from there, the student affairs department developed into student aid and housing and food and health and so on, the ones that you're quite familiar with, and I no doubt we'll talk about.
Right. In terms of those early days, as we saw it, it was growing here and it developed at MUN at that point in time. How else did it develop across say, the Atlantic region? Was it also developing there at that stage, or?
It was developing, yeah, it was developing not, we're going to talk about 1964 on. We'll leave out the phys ed and all the magnificent things that I did in physical education prior to 1954. But in 1964, now, there was a great concern then about housing and about drugs. And the university thought that all universities thought they'd better do something about this. Now, what you have to remember is that at this point in time, the university considered itself substitute parents in loco parentis.
Right.
And we felt very seriously that we should actually be these substitute parents in reality. And as a consequence, many of the rules and regulations that we made were made in that light, that we had a responsibility. We would intervene on students' behalf when they got in trouble with the law. We would, if a student was too obstreperous, we wouldn't hesitate to phone the parent, wherever the parent was, if the parent was in Gander or in northern Newfoundland or anywhere. I wouldn't hesitate, students in St. John's, pick up the telephone and say, gee, your son has done this, and what are we going to do about it? So a lot of the rules that we had were based on in loco parentis. For example, dress. We had dress regulations, what students had to wear to classes. Girls, for example, were not allowed to wear slacks, and they weren't allowed to wear high heels. Now, the reason they weren't allowed to wear high heels was the fact that with these high heels, the heels went through the linoleum on the floor. But boys had regulations. Well, the actual regulation read, and I think I've got it correct, that male students shall at all times be properly dressed. They must wear at classes jacket and tie. Well, we had a bunch of engineers, or would-be engineers, who decided that that's exactly what they would wear to class, jacket and tie, and except for Stanfield's underwear, they went to class in jacket and tie and nothing else on. We would have in residence, an area close to your heart, we would have regulations that girls would have to be in by midnight, and boys were allowed to be in, had to come in by 1 o'clock. Visiting in girls' rooms or in boys' rooms was prohibited. Men were only permitted in the lounges of the women's residences, and vice versa was equally true. In theory, liquor wasn't allowed in the residences, and we had 1 or 2 cases where people were evicted from residence because they brought in a bottle of beer or a case of beer. And the thought of running the residence as you run it now, with men and women sleeping on the same floor, my goodness, when I was there, that would be absolutely. I remember another cute little story. I don't remember the fellow's name. I think it was McLean, but he was at Mount A. And we were talking one time about residence regulations, and he said at Mount A, he said, we don't stand for any of this stuff. We do allow visiting in the rooms, but the doors have to be open by the width of 1 book. And all feet must be on the floor at the one time. So there was, the width of a book was the subject of great debate, just as to whether it was the spine of the book or whether it was the length of the book, or anyway, that was one of the rules that they had at Mount A. So we struggled with rules, and as you can remember, a growing concern, certainly amongst students, was representation. And if my memory serves me correctly, you were prominent, when you were a student, you were very prominent in 1 or 2 sit-ins after Senate meetings. The junior division was a problem close to your heart. But there was a move underway amongst students at that time, all across Canada, and I suppose all across the United States, for a representation on governing boards. They wanted representation on Senate, and you, I think, probably were the first student representative on University Senate here at Memorial. They wanted representation on departmental committees. They wanted student evaluation of professors, and you were part of that. So all these things were concerns. But here at Memorial, where it wasn't us at all, pioneered was in 1965, Joey Smallwood had a thinkers conference here in St. John's. And one of the things that Joey Smallwood said was, or not Joey Smallwood, Joey Smallwood invited John Kenneth Galbraith, probably the most famous economist in the United States, a confidant of presidents and so on. He was invited here to give the keynote lecture at this thinkers conference, which is primarily concerned about the university. And John Kenneth Galbraith, he told the audience, he told us, that the greatest resource a community has is in the education of its young people. And he made this statement. He said, university students should be paid salaries to attend university. So in 1966, Joe Smallwood called a meeting here on the campus, and salaries for students and free tuition were introduced for the first time in Canada. This was the start of the student aid program in Canada. And if you will recall, in the first year of the program, everybody got free tuition, and fifth and fourth years got salaries.
That's right.
You got $100 if you lived outside St. John's, and you got $50 if you lived inside St. John's. I'm told that down in Petty Harbor, there was 2 cousins. One lived on one side of the street and one lived on the other. And because one was in metropolitan St. John's and one was outside St. John's, one got $100 a month and one got 50. This program turned out to be as you recall, turned out to be too expensive. And the question of need then was introduced. And the money that was used for free tuition and salaries was, the need factor was brought in. And then we got the student aid program, which, again, then it was part grant and part loan. Right. Now I understand it's mostly loan.
It's all loan.
All loan
yes.
now.
Yeah. Continuing on with the development at Memorial, like there was a whole bunch of services that were included under student services, and it seemed to evolve. And some often said that student services ended up with everything that nobody else wanted.
Yeah, I think that's true.
So just describing, back in the 70s and thereabouts, what were some of the areas that you were responsible for, in addition to the obvious ones of residence? Were there any other ones that...
Well, you see, when they, at nearly every university, if you look at student affairs departments, there probably are, just like you say, nobody else wanted, or other people had a terrible time trying to handle it. The development of the department or the area was usually based on, well, there were certain givens, but then there are others where the personality of the individual involved meant that would he take on this. For example, student affairs at the university at one time was responsible for security on the campus. Right. Student affairs was and is responsible for the bookstore. But that was because of local circumstances and of the personalities of the people involved. But we had housing. That was the first thing we had to do. Was we were right in the middle of a building program in residences, and so we completed Peyton College, and we were sort of the stimulus for the denominational colleges across the road on the other side of the campus. Student health. That's one of the very first things we started, was student health, and we had that probably when I was still in phys ed. We used to have a doctor come in 4 or 5 afternoons a week. Dr. Body, I believe it was. Yeah, Dr. Body. We had student health, and then we had counseling. Now, counseling was a real problem. Faculty members were complaining that they felt they weren't competent to handle personal problems of students. Some obviously were well able to handle, but a lot of them felt that they were not qualified and felt uneasy advising students. So we decided that we should start a counseling center. Now, this was in 1966 or 1965, and one of the things that we were really concerned about then was the growth of the university. We were about 2,800, and we knew we were going to go up to 5,600 very quickly. And who was going to handle if we had a problem now with counseling? So we decided we would look for a person who'd had a lot of experience in counseling, and we settled on Charlie Preston, Dr. Preston. And he came, and with a mandate was to develop the best counseling center in Canada, keeping in mind the problem that we had of the age of the students coming into Memorial. At that time, grade 11 was the entrance area. We had students coming from all parts of Newfoundland, some of whom had never taken chemistry or physics, never ever. Some had never done biology. They were coming in, and Mr. Morgan, President Morgan, he came up with the idea of the junior division. And your memories of junior division are probably the same as mine. Those were hectic years, but the counseling center played a big role in back then. So there was the counseling center, there was the bookstore, there was the liaison with student organizations. We were the main contact with the Council of Students Union, and then the various other organizations like the various faculty societies, the clubs and societies on the campus. And we inherited we got into fundraising. Why we got into fundraising, I don't know, but we did. And we've been in that for quite a while. Now, I think that's about all I did.
That's all. Very good.
All I can remember.
In terms of, again, I remember one of the first things when I became involved with student services at Memorial was we had a meeting of the deans and directors, and I remember that quite clearly, of the Atlantic region, where all of the deans of men and women from the various campuses came and visited Memorial. So that would have been in the early 70s when I started. So it was already in place at that point in time. Now, how did that group evolve? How did they sort of get together? And I know they were the forerunner, I think, of what is now called the Atlantic Association of College and University Student Services. But what was the impetus to get those people together?
Well, I'll tell you now. It's a long story, but it needs telling. When I was appointed in 1964, I felt that I needed to know a bit more about student services across Canada. And someone told me, or somehow we learned, that the leaders in student affairs across Canada were going to have a week-long seminar on student affairs in Canada. And we mostly talked about liquor and residence rules and drugs. They decided that they would put on this course for people like myself across Canada. So on our campus, we decided we would go to this seminar. It was at Loyola in Montreal, and 3 of us went. I went, Sarah McGlashan went, and Mrs. Frecker went to have a look at this. It turns out there was only one other student, and the staff was about 16. They were expecting 30 or 40. But at that meeting, I met the people who were involved in UCPA, which has various names, but it's basically University Career Planning Association. Now it has various mutations: the University College Planning, University Counseling, etc. And a student affairs group was formed under UCPA, University Career Planning Association. And at the end of that conference, I was asked when I went back to the Maritimes, and then I wasn't from the Maritimes, I was from Newfoundland, would I see if we could organize a branch of what was going to be called the Canadian Student Affairs Association, which was a part of UCPA. I came here and I contacted all the universities in the Maritimes, and we arranged our first meeting, which was called Deans of Men and Deans of Women. And we met in Moncton. And we formed a little organization. And there was a representative there from every university in the Maritimes. And so we formed the Atlantic Association of Deans of Men and Deans of Women. Now, nobody was prohibited. The student aid officer was quite welcome to come, the housing manager, the food services, health services, the chaplaincy. They could all come to this if they want. And a goodly crowd came. And so we really got organized. I think it was 1965, and maybe 1966. But every university was represented there.
And who are some of the names? I remember Nelson Ferguson, because I remember how he used to play in his band, the Dixieland Six or whatever it was. And
yeah, Nelson Ferguson was professor of marine engineering at Tons, Technical University of Nova Scotia. And he was a Scotsman. And he was also registrar. He was registrar, and he was dean of students at Nova Scotia Tech.
And registrar was a common role.
That was quite common for
combination.
It's quite common to have the registrar as part of student affairs, and to have phys ed, the athletic department, not the physical education department, the athletic department part of that was quite common. The one character that we had there was Father Hennessy. Father Hennessy was at St. Mary's. He'd been Dean of Men, I suppose, for 40 years, so he knew all the answers. Oh, we all loved Father Hennessy. He was a great fellow. Elizabeth Chard, she was also from St. Mary's. Ken Bendelaire was also from St. Mary's, and they were in different roles. Elizabeth Chard was also the registrar and dean of residence there. At Dal, George Uline was from Dal, and the financial aid man at Dal, who was there in 1966, still there. You remember his name? I can't, but
I've lost
brain
it now.
is much,
Yes.
And then our leader, or one of our great leaders at the time, was Eric Henson. Eric was dean of students at Acadia, and Eric was there. What other universities are there in the Maritimes? Mount A, there was, UNB, there was Barry Thompson.
Right.
And Joyce Kidd. They were deans of men and deans of women, but they were there. They ran the residences. So residences at that time was a pretty keen issue, and this in loco parentis was very much, for example, Sarah, just the other day I saw a paper that Sarah McGlashan, Sarah Drinkwater, wrote in 1967 on censorship and the student newspaper. And we felt that if the student newspaper, like the Muse here one time, published a picture of the Pope standing beside a toilet, and the thing said, Gideon, a Bible in every room and holy water in the toilets. And this didn't exactly go over very well, and we
certainly not in St. John's at that time.
No, we had to have the editor of the Muse, fortunately I can't remember his name or I'd tell you, had to have him in, and he had to be reprimanded, and that was all right. He was fine. He didn't mind. They didn't mind being. Oh yeah, the other thing I wanted to talk to you briefly about at this organization was discipline.
Okay.
I'll tell you about Memorial, but at Memorial, I made the rules, I enforced the rules, and then I sat in judgment on anybody who violated the rules. So I was the formulator of the rules, I was the policeman, and then I was the judge. Well, the poor student didn't stand a chance. I mean, there's no way he could, it's just impossible. And that was all changed by the famous Rogalski case, right, when Rogalski challenged this in loco parentis view. And I think an awful lot of things at Memorial in terms of student concerns goes back to Rogalski and his challenging the status quo, right, saying this was right. And most people agreed that you shouldn't be able to make the rules, enforce the rules, and then sit in judgment if you don't obey them.
Yeah, we've changed very much in that direction, very much more. It's a more legalistic approach, but at the same time, it still continues that the university has a discipline, and it is one of the key areas, and one of the ones that causes probably more trouble for any of us than any other particular area right across the country. Okay, we've got the Atlantic. How did this thing go back to the national? Like Caucus, which is our national organization now, I think it started around 66, 67. Who are some of the key people from the other parts of the country at that point?
Nationally? Well, Magnus Flynn.
I remember that name. Why?
Magnus Flynn was Dean of Students at Sir George William, and later became Concordia.
Right.
It was Loyola and St. George when they went together. He was very influential then. A fellow by the name of George Bouffard, who was at University of
Sherbrooke. Sherbrooke, right.
He was very influential. Our own Eric Hansen, he was very influential. A fellow by the name of Al Ryan, who was Dean of Students at University of Alberta. He was really the father of everybody. There was Cease Solon at McGill, and Emile, I'll just have to say his name is Emile. He was Dean of Students at, no, he wasn't Dean of Students. He was the employment man there. He was the federal government employment officer, but in actual fact, he was Dean of Students. Emile Simard. Now, Emile was a French-Canadian who used to go to these meetings, and everything would be in English except for him, you see, and none of us could handle the French. And Emile would be sitting there, and all of a sudden, his face would go blank, and he would announce, "I have lost my ear.
Okay,
I
what
must
did that
leave."
mean?
And that meant that he could no longer translate the English into French, or the French into English.
Right.
And so "I have lost my ear," he would say, and he'd get up and go out. He was a marvelous, he was really a super fellow.
Now, in the later years, like with you, there was George McMahon at Windsor, and who were some of, now George, I always found it very interesting, very similar developments between Windsor and Memorial, wasn't it?
Well, George and I were very close. Yeah, it was very similar developments. George and I were very close. Back in the 60s, the early 60s, we were one of the young fry coming up. But by the time we got to the 70s, in 71 and 72 was when COSPs became Caucus.
Okay.
You know, I mean, I think these names are terrible, but the ones that you're responsible for are even worse. I mean, sad, and then sad coming into Sisa. I mean,
Sasa. We got sort of
Sasa, yeah. Well, then we decided in this is the Atlantic region now. In 1972, we decided that we would form a new organization that would take in the everybody would be recognized. So we'd get away from the Association of Deans of Men and Deans of Women, and we would become a part of COSPS.
Okay.
So we had the COSPS Atlantic Division, and the first meeting of that COSPS was in 1972, and I think at Moncton, where we at Mount A, where we had the first meeting of the Deans of Men and Deans of Women 10 years, well, not 10 years, but 6 years prior to that. Now, you would know most of the people that were in that in that group in 72, because they were all the young guys coming up and you know, very enthusiastic. And Jim Griffiths.
Jim Griffiths
was the
now at the University of Victoria.
Yes, now
Yeah.
at the University.
And Basha, Marion from UPI was the other person.
Marion Basha.
Right.
Yeah,
Is still involved.
She'll always be Marion Morrison to me. But,
Okay. All right. In terms of the changes that you saw, and where you're on the outside and able to look in, I know you've had some contact with the various organizations over the last few years. Where do you see the big changes that have occurred? What do you think has changed from the days when you were actively involved? You mentioned the in-local parentis as one, and we've become more legalistic, but I'm just wondering, how has student services from the academic side changed? Or is it changed, or how was it when this is one of the ones that is very apropos for us now, is how student services are involved in the academic side of campus and how we integrate with the faculty and the like. How was it when, in the earlier days with student services? Was there a real clear separation? It seems to look like on paper, at least.
Yeah, I think there was a separation. Where it was different with me was that I came to Memorial in '53, and when I came, there were 427 students, 27 on the faculty. So I grew up as being one of the old guard. I like to refer to us as the Morgan Mafia. Memorial has been run for the last 40 years by the Morgan Mafia. They're probably moving out now. Now, this is the president of the university, Mr. Moses, Dr. Moses Morgan, and we always worked with him. And he and I had a very close relationship right from the very beginning. And student affairs was never left out of anything. Like, I suppose I was the longest member of Senate when I finally quit the Senate. So we were involved in all the planning. We were always right in there. But as you say, things change over the years. But personalities have a lot to do with the administration side and the service side and the acceptance side of student services. I think that's important. I see what I see is, I don't know what you're going to do about here in Newfoundland especially, about the employment. I think employment of students is going to become a great issue for people in student services, more so than in any other department of the university. Certainly, financial aid is going to become a great issue. I think there will be a very close liaison. I think that in the future, students who are really very good, academically they're very good, they know what they're about and what they're doing, I think they're going to get on pretty well. Their finances are going to be pretty well looked after by scholarships and bursaries and what the graduate students get.
Fellowships.
What's Don getting?
Yeah.
A fellowship. I think they're going to be looked after. But there's that bunch that are not quite up to that level, and what you are going to do about them, I don't know. I think it's going to be especially a big problem here in Newfoundland, but it's certainly going to be a big problem across Canada. I was just talking to a young lady yesterday who just got her honors, Bachelor of Commerce in Marketing, and she's off to Calgary tomorrow to see if she can't get a job before the crowd next year graduates.
Yeah. Yes.
But I think there'll be a closer and closer relationship between academic departments, academic programs, and people in student affairs. You hear faculty now talking about, gee, I really don't know how to teach. There are an awful lot of faculty people who feel they don't know how to teach. Excuse me. Knowing the course material is not everything.
Right.
It's so that's the areas I think that student affairs will become. You say student services all the time now, don't you?
We use both, and it's become, actually it's one of those great debates that I guess goes on from time immemorial, where student affairs and services. The services have become a very important aspect of it, and in many campuses have probably taken over from the in-local parentis and the concern for the student as to the services we provide. And the affairs, which we keep in very close here at Memorial and a number of other campuses, refers to the more general nature and realizing that the whole student is what we have to look at, and not just providing with food services and residence services, but actually looking at the individual and how they develop as well. I guess the other area that I'd like to go back to a bit is that with the faculty notion of this and the academics, there's no question that the faculty certainly, I think, are quite supportive. But one of the areas that we're really struggling with on all our campuses, both from student services and everything, is the declining resources. And the issue of how we can continue to provide everything we've done in the past. I guess in many ways you were fortunate in that we were through the better times for higher education. Do you have any comments on how we should try to preserve some of these areas? How can we keep what we had before in terms of our focus on the student that we had in the earlier days?
Well, I think one of the things that you're going to have to come to grips with is the stuff we see around us here, these television cameras. We haven't even stuck our toenails into the use of the technology.
Right.
We haven't even touched. I can see that. I remember when we were planning the residences. Some fool said to us, "You better put coaxial cable into all the residences now that you're building them. Why don't you put them in?" I thought, now that's a lot of nonsense, putting this cable in. Well, poor old Peyton College was hardly up when the students were over demanding they wanted a television set. So we had a television set put in the lounge. Well, then they wanted television in their own rooms, and it was too bad that we didn't put the cable in when we had. Except that now you're putting fiber optics into just about everything. It very well may be that we'll never have any, in 10 years, we may never have any residences. We may not even have students on campus. We've just built, well, not just built, to me it's just been built, the Queen Elizabeth Library. Now I read that we can take all the material in the Queen Elizabeth Library, put it onto CD-ROMs or something like CD-ROMs, and we can go out anywhere. Anywhere in Newfoundland, and you can come in. And our daughter, who lives in Aberdeen in England, she's just gotten her BSc degree in the Open University, and she's gone to 6 classes, I think.
Right.
And that's over 12 or 14 years, and she's gone to six classes, done everything else on television or on radio. So the impact of the technology is going to be just fantastic. absolutely fantastic.
It's true. We're going to have to. Like you say, the student is where we're talking about our virtual classrooms, and many people are starting to talk about the virtual student and the issues that we're going to have to deal with, not coming face to face with them, and dealing with them on the internet, and dealing with them through interactive television and the like. So, yeah, that's certainly
when say 15 years ago, when Peter Dawson was here, Peter Dawson was head of philosophy, professor of philosophy, and he convinced the university that we should put television screens in every room. Now, do we still have, I haven't looked around to see.
Almost all of them have disappeared.
Have they all gone out again?
Almost all.
Now, what's taken its place?
That's a good question. I really don't know. I think that there are far fewer of the, we have some super classrooms now with all the media in it, but no, I think we have gone away from that, and we do less on campus with television. I really don't know the answer to that particular one.
I must inquire as to that. Oh, I think student affairs, you're going to be restricted in budgets. What your emphasis has to be, I really can't say. I don't know what it is. The thing has changed. Well, not 100%, but almost 100%. Not since I started, but since I left. I mean, the changes have been just fantastic, just marvelous. And that's 12, that's 14 years now. What'll happen in the next 10 years? Gee, I don't know. I never would have said 20 years ago the changes that have taken place would be so dramatic. And they have been dramatic.
Oh, very dramatic, no question. I think, and as the technology increases, we are going to be faced with new challenges.
Oh, yes, I think so. I think so.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for spending this time with us here today. It's one of those scenarios that what we're doing within Caucus, and we're wanting to preserve a lot of our heritage in student services, because, as you say, it has changed dramatically in the last 12 years, and in another 10 years, we can't even begin to guess where it is. No. Thank you very much.